Oh no. Greetings and salutations. Hopefully, I feel like the interface today was just a moment ago was acting kind of slow and wonky, so hopefully it's okay. Of course, I have a truck that's beeping loudly outside my window. I'm on the second floor part of the building, and even though it's a relatively quiet street in Brooklyn, New York, still there is often comings and goings which affect things like this or when I'm recording videos. Thankfully, it's usually more annoying and distracting for me, and the sounds don't actually get through to you, which is good. So I thought that lunchtime stream I did yesterday, went really well. I appreciate those of you who jumped in and chatted with me. The audience participation is always welcome. It can feel sometimes like I'm just talking out to the void. So when I see folks are watching, thanks for the folks who are tuning in at the moment. And then, of course, I see folks interacting with the chat. It gives me something to riff off of. It just helps, because otherwise you could definitely get this vibe like you're just sitting here talking to yourself, which is kind of true in a way. And let me know if the times. I'm Eastern time. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. So for me, it's 11:30. I could probably start it a little bit earlier, a little bit later. I'm going to try to make these kind of a regular thing. So if there's a time that works better for the folks who tune in, let me know. Maybe I can move things around a little bit. And it's my daughter's last day of school before summer break, so that will also alleviate some of the scheduling. Obviously, day jobs and work dependent, but we'll see how it goes. So the last video I did was addressing this. I called it the parable of the interesting dragon, and I got some great comments in the chat and comments after the fact. Really good stuff. My topic for today, and I'm happy to go anywhere as folks see fit. Please, if you have comments or tangents, drop them into the chat. I'm happy to go where the conversation takes us. But I thought we could start with essentially a follow-up to a video I did about, what did I call it? Creatures as class. And there were a lot of comments. It created a lot of conversation, which is great. And so I thought I would kind of address some of that and hopefully kind of build into essentially what do you do with player characters or players who want to play monstrous player characters? How do you fit that into your game? What are the sort of obstacles that might pop up, and maybe some ways to address them, or at least some ideas? Some of the stuff I got back on that video was very interesting. Of course, as I knew there were folks who were pushing back against the idea. I think a lot of that pushback came in probably variations in essentially two forms. The first one was setting, and I totally understand the setting. And I think I made a whole video a while back now on that. I really feel like setting is the most important thing. As a GM, if I'm going to look to where do I really need to preserve, or what do I really need to, what's the one thing I want to protect? It's the setting. And I think the reasons for that are that it really anchors everything you're going to do. It's the thing that I think, at least when I've pitched games and run session zeros, the biggest part of it, the part that I'm really selling the players on, is the setting. So I think it's important, once we've all agreed on that setting, that we keep to that agreement. If it turns out that the whole table wants a different setting, we can discuss it and make adjustments. But beyond that, once we've decided, hey, here's what we're going to be playing, I kind of think that you keep to that contract until you as a group decide to alter that contract. So I understand that objection. However, all that being said, I think sometimes what happens is I want to, or maybe I should say it like this. I want to separate two things. First is this, whatever this concept is antithetical to my setting from something that just hasn't been expressed in the setting yet. I don't know if that makes sense. I will try to explain. You may say, I see this come up, and I saw this come up in the comments. You may say, Dragonborn don't exist in my setting. And that's fine. But could they exist in your setting? And I think sometimes a GM goes from, well, I haven't put them in my setting, so they don't exist at level, or at 0. And that becomes, they can't possibly ever exist in my setting. They're impossible in my setting. And I don't think those two are the same. Fred Daniel says in the chat, I always ask, why do you want to play a monster? Is there another way to achieve the character you desire? Is there something unique about the creature that you find compelling? And those are great questions to ask, because let's take Dragonborn from the example. Maybe given the lore of your setting, the idea of having this kind of pseudo dragon class doesn't work, or there's already something else in that place. Maybe you can say, hey, what are these things about Dragonborn you want to play? Maybe you can't be exactly a Dragonborn, but you can be something that is similar to the Dragonborn, or gives you the Dragonborn-ish stuff that you want without it being a Dragonborn. So that's also an option. But going back to what I was saying a moment ago, I think there's a difference between, hey, I just haven't put it in my setting yet, so yeah, it doesn't exist in the lore that's been created so far, from it's impossible to exist. I was trying to think about what examples I could give about this. I think I'll use Lord of the Rings, because I think it's a fairly classic example of a setting that on its face seems to be fairly narrow in what you would consider playable creature types. But then I think there's actually elements of it that you might look at and realize, oh, maybe there's greater scope here than I thought. So we think about the classic fantasy playable creature classes. Lord of the Rings is kind of the template for that. You have your dwarves, you have your elves, you have your humans, you have your hobbits, halflings, however you want to call them. So you might say to yourself, if a player comes up to you and you pitched, you're getting ready to play a Lord of the Rings style game, or a game that exists in a similar universe or in that universe itself, and let's say they say, I want to play a lycanthrope of some sort. And you might look at that, and maybe your idea is kind of a World of Darkness or sort of a horror genre, a werewolf or something, and you say, oh, that doesn't belong in Lord of the Rings. Pish posh, enough with you. Take your elf, halfling, or human and be happy. But there are werewolves in the Silmarillion. They're evil, but they do exist. So there's that. But you might say, well, we're not playing back in the First Age, and those were evil, and Sauron created them, so blah, 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 blah. My point still stands. Okay. Well, there's Bjorn in The Hobbit. He's not a werewolf. He's a werebear. Could we not conceive that if a Bjorn exists, that there might be a wolf version of Bjorn somewhere in the world? Maybe it's unique or quasi-unique, but could be there, right? We can envision the possibility. I think the Lord of the Rings, even as we might think of it as being tamped down. And here comes the street cleaner. I'm just pausing. You may not hear it, but it's super loud to me. Street cleaner comes. Street cleaner goes. Okay. The concept of a werewolf in the Bjorn vein may be possible. There's nothing in Tolkien that says that Bjorn was the only one of his kind that ever existed and ever could exist. I think the Lord of the Rings, when you actually delve into the text, there's all kinds of these little one-off, interesting, unique or pseudo-unique creatures that you could bump into. You got your Tom Bombadils, you've got your Bjorns. Who's to say there isn't another type like that? And if there can be, then you might look at that player and say, well, maybe you're going to be unique and there's not going to be a whole bunch of you, but you might have, a family or whatever, but there's not a ton of you out there. But yeah, you can be this one-off. It's like all the noises are coming in at me. You could be I might have to close my window. You could be the one-off of this type that exists in the world. You could be the Bjorn that the hobbits and the dwarves run into, so to speak, on your adventure towards the Lonely Mountain. It is possible. And I think that's really maybe the biggest thing to look at, is just because it hasn't been written yet doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it hasn't been written yet. You could write it. But I think a lot of GMs, for reasons, and obviously if you're a GM that feels fervently that they shouldn't be there, then you can hit me to what these reasons are. But I think often we like to just drop that. Well, it's impossible in my setting, and I think sometimes it can be. I think if sometimes it definitely can seem impossible. I think a a tiefling in Lord of the Rings might be tough because even if you want to say that, well, they're not half demon, but maybe they're half Balrog or something, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because in the lore of Lord of the Rings, never get the sense that those Balrogs are going and having relations with anything to make half of anything, right? So you might say, well, that I don't know what that is, but you can maybe look at something else. We do know that maybe not Balrogs, but at one point other of the Valar came and inhabited Middle Earth, and I think Melian, I think she had kids with the elf. So let's see. Oh, so I'm hitting the chat. There's very little. This is nothing. There's very little point in having monstrous PCs if those PCs aren't going to be monstrous. If you are monstrous, how are you going to interact with humans? If you aren't going to be monstrous, be a human. Well, okay. So when I say monstrous, really, I guess I'm using the kind of somewhat meta term from sort of old school D&D, which is essentially anything not a PC was a monster, even to the point that in a dungeon, if you ran into a human that wasn't a hireling or something, they were basically a monster. I'm really just meaning anything outside a player character, but it does encompass things that can be monstrous. So monstrous, but of course, in some ways, that's really just the idea of what is a monster is really a construct, right? Because if you live in the kingdom of Minotaurs, are you a monster that you're a Minotaur? No, the humans might be monsters. So how are we defining what a monster is? I'm simply looking at it as taking all the races, all the creature types that are in, say, the monster manual, right? And those are kind of monsters. Of course, there are entries for humans and elves and dwarves in there also. But that's kind of a good point to think about just in the fiction, right? So yeah, in this society, if you're a Minotaur PC, you might be considered a monster. But if you go to the mountains or wherever the Minotaurs hang out, you're not a monster. You're a regular Joe. The monsters are someone else. They may be the humans that come to Minotaur country, and they're the monsters, the folks who are maybe invading, threatening, doing whatever. So the term monster is very relative. But when I speak about monstrous PCs, what I'm talking about is that concept of outside the narrow band of player character creatures that are expressed in, say, your rule book, whichever rule book you're looking at, whatever, all those other creature types, the ones that look in the three brown books, Gygax lays it out there. Hey, if you want to have a player that wants to play anything, make a go of it. And that's kind of where I'm driving at with that. And then it's up to you, I think, in dealing with how you role play one of those creatures. That's where you as the GM and you as the player get together. If you really do have certain aspects of Minotaurs in your world, for example, then you need to talk about with your PCs about that. But there's always exceptions to rules. There's always the picture of the goat and the lion who have been friends since they were kids and since they were little, cubs, and I don't know, whatever a baby goat is called. And so even though 99% of the lions out in the world would slaughter that goat, this particular lion, the goat is its buddy, right? Those exceptions always exist. So even if you have monsters that act monstrously most of the time, there's probably going to be some outliers, or that you can imagine there could be an outlier that acts differently than the normal monster. We all talk about this, or as I do, and I see a lot of people do this in terms of monsters. The monster manual is just looking at your kind of average baseline. If you were just to spot one of these animals in the wild, here are sort of the assumptions you can make about it. It's not locking everything into that template. They're all going to have slightly different attributes. And that means that there could be these ones that have different personalities that are maybe more friendly to other species than maybe the majority or the average of their creature type. Let's see. Now, Nothing says, I just ran a 6-session campaign where the party were bullywugs. I think such things work great as a party, less so for one PC. I mean, that sounds like an awesome campaign. I mean, there is work to be done, I think, if you're going to do it with one PC, but it also depends on your campaign type. If you're playing a campaign that's, say, Conan style or Farford and the Grey Mouser, in which really all of the societies and everything in your visit are essentially human. I haven't read all the Farford stories, so maybe there's some where they're not. But basically, everywhere you go, it's all humans. You do find other species and other things, but they're all sort of these one-off creatures from other dimensions or other things that don't have a place in the greater world. Then yes, that if someone said, well, I want to play that, or whatever, that elephant-headed alien from another dimension that Conan runs into in, what was it, Tower of the Elephant? Something like one of those stories, and you want to have that in your campaign, then you'd have to really work out the difficulty. That might be great fodder for adventuring, though, too. But yes, that does add an element of, okay, we got to figure out how we're going to make this work and if it's doable. On the other hand, if you're in playing a very, like your average Forgotten Realms game, or say Star Wars, where you're on the Outer Rim and there's just a melting pot of different species running around, then no, that's not a big deal. So in some ways, that comes back to the setting. What are the restrictions of the setting? How's that going to work? I will say, though, that a lot of these obstacles, to me, are the things that you can play out. See how they work with it. I don't know what the harm would be in letting them try. You could say, okay, look, we're playing and we're going to be mostly in the human world, or the world is essentially majority, society is mostly human, and everything else is kind of an outlier or exists in some other planes and is only here in the human world for very limited whatever, but here you are. You're going to have to figure out what to do. Some of that you can cover in their backstory. What about if, okay, you're this elephant thing, but you were like Superman or something. You were encased in an egg that was in an asteroid that smacked down next to somebody's farm. They took you in. They took care of you. In their home and in their village, they actually know you, so you can do stuff there. That doesn't necessarily help you when you head to the big city or you head to other villages further away, but you have a home base that you can go back to, and maybe that village ends up being your first hub village, and then you can try to figure out ways to game it. Maybe they do have to wait outside town while other stuff is done, or they do something out in the woods while everyone else is shopping. Maybe they figure something out. Maybe they find spells, or other people find spells, or they find magic items to help them. And I'm not suggesting you just give that stuff away, but those can be goals. We're going to be going to the capital. We're going to need to spend a significant amount of time there. I need to find a way to disguise myself. Now that can be a goal. Have anyone heard of a ring of disguise or something of that sort to help do that? I think a lot of these problems can be turned into actionable adventure hooks. They don't have to be, and I think that's something else that really came to my mind, is I feel like a lot of people talk about the obstacles, but in ways that make them seem insurmountable, as opposed to some of these just become adventure things. How do you deal with that, right? How do you get around that? Let the players figure it out. And to my mind, hey, try to figure it out. If it becomes unworkable after a couple of sessions and they come around and say, it's just not happening. It's not fun for me to do that, or whatever it is, then you can kind of address it again and say, okay, well, it's not working. Let's maybe get you to do something else, or let's figure something out. But my thing is, I don't think there's any harm in trying. One of the other objections that came up was someone saying that, well, if I got to make this one creature class, I got to make like dozens of them. But I don't see it like that, just because. And their thing was like, well, if there's a matrix of you're playing an AD&D style kind of OSR game, or something where your heritage and your archetype are split. So, you have dwarf cleric, dwarf thief, dwarf fighter, etc. Then if someone wants to play a Minotaur fighter, let's say, then I've got to make all the other combinations. Oh, I have to make a Minotaur cleric, and I have to make a Minotaur thief, and I have to do that. And then it kind of blows up and you say, it's too much work. Well, I don't think so. I mean, yes, if you feel like you have to do it that way, then yes, that you could say, well, that's a lot of work. But to my mind, it's ad hoc. Okay, you need a Minotaur fighter. I just make you a Minotaur fighter. I'm not going to worry about Minotaur clerics, thieves, whatever, until there's a need for them. But this just comes back to you don't have to. I think we make these obstacles and kind of make them. It's like it really to me. It's excuse making in the form of, well, I'm going to talk about all these obstacles and therefore not work it. Where instead you could maybe think about what the solutions to those things are, like not how it isn't possible. I think instead of, maybe that's a better way of putting it. Instead of thinking of the things of why we shouldn't do this, think about how might we do this and how, and would that be cool? So if going back to say a Minotaur, or we could say a bullywug or whatever, instead of thinking, well, these are the ways that it's going to be difficult, there's also a whole other part where you could think about these are the things that it's going to be, then it's going to add to the campaign. Because, and I did this a long time ago. And I mentioned that in another video. I was starting a campaign. It was sort of I was playing in a game, and the DM wanted to take a break, so I said, okay, I'll run something. But we were running a sci-fi game. I wanted to run a D&D type game because fantasy is kind of where my heart is as far as role-playing games. So I said, okay, I want to run a D&D game. This is during the 3.3 or 3.5 days. I had that Savage Species book, and one of the players really wanted to play a Minotaur. So it happens to be the one example. I think it might even have been in a magazine or something else too prior to the Savage Species book coming out. They wanted to play a Minotaur. And I thought, like, okay, well, this is going to have some challenges. I think, like folks are saying, how does that Minotaur integrate with the party? I think the rest of the party was your general elf, human. I don't even know if there was a dwarf. There might have been humans and elves, I think. How do they integrate in that society? And most of the game I'd planned around the kind of human, or that sort of human, elvish kind of world. But then I also thought about, well, what can I do with a Minotaur? And so I started coming up with, what is Minotaur society like? And I kind of built this sort of Minotaur. It was very much, I will say, I borrowed very heavily from Klingons in Star Trek in terms of what this Minotaur culture society would be like. But that became a real added thing in the game with these Minotaurs who were this kind of powerful species, and the player was able to interact with them. I brought the party in so that there were elements of what they were trying to do that caused them to interact with the Minotaurs. So then there were these moments in which, sure, the Minotaur player had to kind of sort of be in the background or try to figure out a way to fit in when the other players were kind of doing their thing. But they also had elements where they had to go into these Minotaur areas, and that player got to step in the forefront, and the other players had to kind of sit in the back. And they really got to interact with both of those. So them choosing to play a Minotaur, or putting that, throwing that out there as an option, I think really ended up enhancing the game, because it allowed me to develop these aspects of the world and of the campaign that I hadn't been thinking about before. And I think it would be the same thing. If you have one bullywug, and the bullywug never gets to interact with anything bullywuggish, and they're just tormented from day one by everybody else. Yeah, that's a tough road for the bullywug character. But there might be aspects of bullywug society that are important. If it's a campaign, why is this bullywug here? What is their backstory about? How do they fit in with this party? How does that fit in with what bullywugs are doing? Now it makes me think about bullywugs as well. What is bullywug society like? What are their goals as as these cultures? If there's kingdoms of bullywugs, or however they are organized, the Democratic Republic of Bullywugdom, what do they want? How does this character fit in with them? Really can add extra dimension, add extra ideas. So yes, it's good to look at, here are the challenges of playing this particular monstrous creature, but there might also be benefits. So don't just look at the challenges as things as here's why not. Think about, well, here are the challenges. What can we do with them? And also, what are the things that it gives me? Because I do think it can give you something about it. But I'm not trying to say it's not challenging. There are certainly, the further you get away from a human or human-ish kind of creature, yes, if all else is equal, there are going to be more challenges for you as a GM, for the player who is running them. So I'm not trying to say that, oh, well, it's all the same. No, but I think it seemed like very often that the GMs who were opposed to it were taking well, I guess you could call it a doom and gloom response. It's just, here's all the reasons why not. Here are all the barriers. Here's all the extra whatever. And I think that while I'm not going to say that there aren't obstacles and there aren't difficulties and there aren't these things, there are other things to balance it. And sometimes I would look at it and say, well, if you look at these other side, maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's worth it for my campaign, right? Look at them as opportunities to think about my setting in a different way, opportunities to think about the campaign in a new way. And of course, you're giving an opportunity to a player to play something potentially unique and interesting that they want to play. And I would always rather have a player who is jazzed about their character than someone who is taking a character because I've, for my own reasons, just decided to kind of erase it. But I am not trying to say, hey, always. I'm not a proponent of, well, if the player wants it, just give it to them. The player wants to give it to them. No, it's all conversation. But I do think, hey, where you can find compromise, where you can make things work, I think you should try to make things work. There was one interesting objection, and I was actually going to respond to it. I think it came up in Reddit, but somebody else beat me to the punch, and I thought, I'm not going to pile on. I'll just leave it. Which was basically that some of these creatures are so alien in their intelligences that how could you possibly role play as something like a beholder or in a lithid or something of that ilk? Because they're just so alien and their motivations are so unknown and everything that it can't be done. But of course, the obvious answer to that is, well, you as the GM, if you're ever going to use those creatures in your game, you are role playing as them. So if you can do it, then a player can do it. And frankly, we can't really effectively role play as something super alien to us. We can try to give the trappings of it. So maybe you have a beholder and you just decide they're gonna instantly use one of their eye stalks to destroy something that's the color pink. And that just becomes, and why am I doing it as a GM? It's random, but we're hoping that in the fiction, it's going to seem like it's a clue to some greater mystery or some greater thing that nobody can understand. But really, we're all in a way trapped inside our human brains, and we can give things the trappings of alienness, but we really can't make them truly alien. And as GMs, we do not have some superpower of role play that our players do not possess. If it is okay for me to play an Elithid or a Beholder or something similar, then it should be fine for a player to give a shot. I am not somehow inherently, because I am in the GM chair, a superior or more advanced role player than the players are. There probably are some creatures that you'd be hard pressed just in their basic form to role play as, just because they're so simple. There's nothing to them. Like you think of, well, I want to be a gelatinous cube PC. That might take some doing, but we're playing fantasy games, right? We're playing these games that really are all about our imagination. So maybe we could think about a story in which a gelatinous cube somehow was able to supercharge their intelligence. They were consuming a wizard and they were struck by lightning or something, or magic lightning. The wizard's last spell went off, and just the way the energies went, somehow their brains became merged. So it's gelatinous cube and wizard at the same time. And so the gelatinous cube started putting on it was able to take its cube and sort of reformulate to take on a humanoid appearance. And it started putting on clothes, and it started sort of covering itself up and started figuring out ways to speak in some weird gurgly, gelatinous way. Bam, there you go. There's your gelatinous cube wizard PC. Of course, there would be challenges to doing that, and I have no idea how I would stat it up, but it's a role-playing game. It's a fantasy. Why couldn't some weird happenstance happen that just there's one of them in the world? I'm not suddenly making gelatinous cube cities and gelatinous cube councils. I know this does not mean that there are gelatinous cube thieves and gelatinous cube clerics, but this weird happenstance, maybe it happens once in 100 or 100,000 years. So you when you know where to look, you can look back in the lore and see these weird things where gelatinous cubes would somehow merge with people. It's just some weird thing that happens 1 in a million times. we can make it happen. So if somebody wanted to do that, make it happen. Maybe there are no gelatinous cubes in your setting. Oh, okay, maybe you can come up with something else, whatever. But my point is that, I'll let your imagination roll with it. See what comes up with it. Have that conversation with your player and look at the positives. Look at the fun you could have with it. Look at what does it say about your world that these things might exist. Turn it into how can we make this an additive thing as opposed to only looking at the negative things. I know that way back at Gygax's table, one of his original players, or not the absolute original, but one of those players played a Balrog PC. I don't think those stats have ever come out. So I would love to see what the advancement looked like for a Balrog. I think that is one challenge, obviously, once you get to, oh yeah, I'm going to say yes, or I'm going to have that conversation, and I'm looking at it, and I myself am as intrigued about what this player character's possibilities are as the player. So we go to that next step, which is how do we stat this bad boy out? I don't have any super guidance. I think you're going to have to play it by ear. I think the closer you get to, humanness, the more, or human norm, it's going to be easier. I'm sure there are lots of things out there. I mean, the one thing with looking at stuff on the internet is that it's really, this is the, what's that? Oh, there's that site, a D&D wiki. Oh boy. This is where you can run into issues when you go to try to find out guidance is people have such various differing ideas on what is balance. Now I know in OSR terms, balance is a little bit different, but there are balancing elements. I think when people talk about the OSR like there's no balancing, it's not true. The balancing simply is different than what we think about in the modern game. Something like 5th edition, everything is balanced either at level, essentially, like you can call it level 0 for your creature heritages, and then it's balanced level to level for your class archetypes. So a fighter at level 1 is supposed to be balanced against a wizard level 1, and then at level 7 balanced against whatever level 7. And so all these classes are kind of in lockstep all the way up the advancement chain. OSR games, it's not the case. In your average, well, I'll say OSR games, because OSR games are now, it's so broad. I don't even feel like I can really just say OSR because it encompasses so many different mechanics and things now. But say in your white box, basic expert, AD&D, that kind of game, you will see that at individual levels, the classes, whether they are your class archetypes separate from your heritage, or in BX where they're merged together, they are not balanced level to level. They're more closely balanced to the experience point requirements. You can see that if you look at something like the Thief class versus a Magic User class. The Thief class levels up very quickly relative to, say, a Magic User. So for 2 or say 5,000 experience points, a Magic User might just be at level 2, level 2.5. I don't know the numbers exactly, but your Thief might be level 4 or 5 already. So they're really saying, in a way, is, okay, this level 2 wizard is balanced against a level 5 Thief. And because they're not all in the same XP requirements, and the XP requirements don't always go in a straight line. Sometimes they'll have steep requirements, then they'll kind of level off for a few levels, and they might go steep again, then level off, or they might go steep for a long time. Right? There are all kinds of, they really play around with those numbers. I don't think that there is, and someone can correct me if there are clear mathematical equations for all those experience point requirements, because I think they were kind of just tweaking them, kind of what feels right for these. So when you're doing it in OSR, trying to create a custom class, you have a lot of things to play with. You can front load some things. That's what I mean by front loading, is stuff they have from first level on, which is what you generally see with your dwarves, elves, halflings. They just have certain abilities that are just baked in from the start. And if you look at BX, you can see the how this affects the XP requirements, because say a dwarf, who is essentially a fighter with a few extra abilities, has higher XP requirements per level than a fighter. And you can almost look at that. I guess you could almost split it off and say, here are what they are considering basically the XP cost of being able to notice the slopes of floors and a couple things that they can do. And same thing for elves. If you look at magic user fighter, kind of the block, and then what an elf is, because an elf is both a magic user and a fighter. There's attacks there for those elf abilities. So, but those abilities, some of them are fairly strong in a way, but they don't increase with your experience. Yeah, I think not being able to be charmed is good, but it's only a good until certain levels, in which case it becomes less important. Finding or having a little bit of a better chance of finding secret doors is good, but I think eventually you get better. There are better options for doing that, so those abilities become less so. So when you see those abilities that they're not super game changing, they are somewhat what's the word I'm looking for? Situational in nature, and they're not going to get better and better as they level up, then you can front load those and put it just a general XP tax on each level. When you get to creatures that have abilities that you do expect to scale, or they're super powerful, so you have to scale them. So, if you have a dragon that eventually is going to get dragon breath that does, 10d6 damage, you don't want to, if you give them 10d6, that dragon's breath at first level, you could make that level requirement to level 2 like 1,000,000. They're still going to be supremely overpowered compared to everything else, which would result to probably the party walking around with just the dragon in front, kicking open doors, and just dragons breathing everything. And for at least multiple levels of dungeons until things kind of caught up, unless they were unlucky, they would just rule the day and nobody would be doing anything but that dragon player who's just breathe fire, right? So you look at that and you say, okay, well, I need to tone that way down. Maybe I don't even think they should have it at first level. Maybe I want them to wait. I think a good, not necessarily an absolute guideline, but a good way to think about it is, where do the magic user and cleric spells that do similar things, where do they show up? Because if fireball is on a level 3 or level 4, maybe you say, okay, well, this dragon's breath is kind of more, it's more powerful than fireball, not necessarily in the effect, but the fact that they can do it however many times. And of course, that's another thing, you can limit uses and things like that. But if we're not, we're just dealing on the simplest level, if fireball happens on level 4 for your wizard and they only get to do it once, if I'm going to give somebody this dragon's breath, one, I could say, and I don't know where this started, where you say, okay, you can recharge it on a roll, so that you can't just do it round after round, but you're not limiting it to your long rest, short rest kind of mechanic. You might say, okay, well, if it's 66 at 4th level for the wizard, this dragon can potentially do it a bunch of times. So I'm going to say it's only 2d6. But then thereafter, they can keep adding on to it. Maybe I'll say, okay, well, at level 2, they'll get it. It's only 1d6 damage, but still it's 1d6 against theoretically a bunch of stuff. Hold on, I have a cough coming on. I muted myself, so hopefully you didn't hear that. Excuse me. So you say, all right, well, maybe at 2nd level, they'll get their dragon's breath, but it's only going to be 1d6, and they'll have to roll a 6 to recharge. At 4th level, I'll say, okay, now it's 2d6, and they can recharge it on a 5 and 6, something like that. Let's see. Oh, in the chat, Bandits Keep, dragons can make smoke rings at 1st level. Absolutely. Dragons and wizards with long pipes can make smoke rings at 1st level. Definitely true. And that's another thing. You can look at these abilities and think of how they might progress. So maybe a dragon can produce smoke at 1st level, which can be very useful, particularly when you're thinking outside the box and you want to trap something, escape from something, just confuse something. Maybe they can make smoke, but it's not until that 2nd, 3rd, 4th level where they can actually get the fire to come out with the smoke. So you think of ways to do it, but using those spell lists is a good way to think about, well, when were these abilities generally becoming available? And you can sort of mark those as okay, this is where this character should also get it, or it gives you a baseline of, well, I don't want this dragon to basically overshadow fireball when the wizard gets it. So maybe they can get something not quite as good an effect, but close. But of course, the dragons will keep scaling, whereas the wizard will keep gaining different spells. And you can do that for
for flight and everything else. I think in my other video, I talked about if you really hate the Arakocra or similar species fighting or flying, you can think about, and I think, and people have done this already. They will say, oh, well, wizards don't get flight to level 4, so I don't want my other classes to get it to level 4. Whether you agree or disagree, fine, but that is a way you can sort of find these things along. But ultimately, you're going to have to kind of play it by ear. You're going to have to think about how, what's the word I'm talking about? No, I guess let me back up. You have to play it by ear. You're going to have to really talk to your player about them being flexible. Because we're doing this ad hoc, because there isn't a lot of guidance out there. There's not a lot of math involved. Maybe people have put together guides on how to make a lot of creature classes. I haven't seen them. If somebody has seen them, please drop a note in the chat. But in the absence of all that stuff, you're going to be making decisions. And I don't think you can really worry too much about, is it overpowered? Is it underpowered? I mean, yes, to a degree, but you may not be able to really know, because players are going to do things that you don't anticipate, which I'm sure any GM has seen, where you give an item or an ability that you think has a pretty specific use case, and you think, oh, this isn't too overpowered, I'll give this to them, it'll be fun. And then the players figure out a way to take that ability or that item and run with it. And suddenly you look back and you go, oh my gosh, how did I not see how powerful this thing is? The same thing can happen. It's going to happen. I think it's more important that you talk to the player. And just going back to what I said earlier, this really should all be a conversation, right? You're going back and forth with the player. The player might not get everything they want out of this creature as class, out of this monstrous player, this character. And as a GM, you might give a few things that you didn't necessarily want to give up, but you end up in a place where you both kind of feel good, right? It's a positive negotiation. Nobody gets exactly what they want, but you each get something. And tell them, hey, look, we're going to give this a try. I'm going to write out this advancement, but it's in pencil. And if we get to level 2 and I'm finding that dragon breath is just taking over everything, and it's at a point at which it is being a real determining factor in every single encounter, and it's shining over everybody else and nobody's doing anything because they're just dragon breathing on everything, then we're going to have to go back to the drawing board a little bit, scale it down, change it, and hopefully, and I know this isn't always the case, and if a player's just adamant, like if I don't get exactly what I want, then I'm not, I'm going to hold my breath until I get it. Well, that's probably a cue about that character, right? They have to be, as a player, you have to be willing to work with your GM. As a GM, you need to work with your character, and then you kind of come to that meeting ground in the middle. Dave Mills, younger dragon PCs should need to eat at least their body weight in fresh kills every day and have a finicky palate, like orcs and such taste bad and elves taste great. Sure, absolutely. I have no problem with things like that. I do think we want to be careful. We don't want to turn it into the poison pill. And if you ever heard of poison pill and contracts and things, it's something you put in that is so onerous that that someone would never take it. And I think I remember first hearing about this in football, where they would make these weird contracts that had these clauses in it that were just kind of crazy. And they were kind of so crazy that it would cause one side to just, there's no way they could do it. I'm sure it's come up in other things, and I don't think football invented it. That's just my context. But you just want to make sure that you're doing something that's going to be, and I'm fine with adding things and say, hey, as a player, you're going to play this, you have certain extra responsibilities that you need to take care of. But I want to be careful that it's not so onerous that, like in this case, okay, eating their body weight in fresh kills every day means that they're going to be spending the majority of every day looking for kills, which means, can they adventure while doing that? In the average dungeon, that's going to have mostly things that they're going to find unpalatable, right? So I want to put in something where there is somewhat of a reasonable solution, because, like I said, I want to give them a chance. I'm fine with saying, okay, so let me give you an example from my past as a player. This would be back in the second edition days. We were the group I was in was starting a new campaign, and I had this kind of crazy idea at the time. Horses and cows. Like I said, I would just want it to be something that they could do and not be like, well, now you've pissed off the whole world, so you can't adventure, or now you have to spend all day feeding, which means you're out of the adventures. But yes, you could, if you wanted to be a vampire, you figure out, and you didn't want to prey on people, you got to find out other ways. I'm totally down with that stuff. I just feel like it has to be at a point where, is this something that they could reasonably do and still go out and adventure? Because if it's just going to be the dragon who has to feed all day, well, then you're again, it's kind of in that poison pill territory. It's like, well, now they can't really do anything, therefore they can't play the dragon. But here, let me give you the example from my own past. So playing this game, second edition, and I don't remember how it came up, but I wanted to play something different. And I was in college, so this is probably going to sound like something from someone in college, but hey, I'm sure I've played as much as I sometimes roll my eyes and think, oh, that's what an edgelord you kind of goofy thing to do. This might be my edgelord kind of character. I don't know. You can tell me. Oh, sorry, I missed one comment. Just caught the stream by accident. Can't stick around, but love the content. Thanks. Hey, thanks, Fatty McButterpants. There will be a recording you can check back later. Okay, back to my story. So my maybe edgelordy thing was I wanted to be an ancient living weapon that had been in some war from ages past, from like the first age of the world had been dropped down and then had gotten buried or somehow deactivated or just had lain asleep. Not unlike Durin's Bane, right? They fled, something happened, they were just deep in hiding, and then something awoken them or dug them out or whatever. So kind of a similar thing, though I wasn't I wasn't an evil thing. I was good. But I was this living weapon. So I had certain powers, but I also had certain, they came with certain drawbacks. And I don't remember exactly all the powers, and I don't have that character sheet. But so, for instance, I had I was supposed to be a living weapon. So I kind of pitched that it was kind of a monkish kind of concept. So I was a hand-to-hand, martial artist type, because I think, look, I am the weapon. I don't need a weapon. I am the weapon. Well, the limitations were that I didn't have any kind of missile weapons, and I couldn't use any weapons, because why would a living weapon need to use a weapon? They don't. They are the weapon. So I really was limited to, I had to get in and mix it up in melee. And of course, sometimes that's fine. Sometimes you're thinking, I don't really want to get into melee, but I didn't have a choice as a character, because I am a weapon. I can't be a weapon that really refuses to get in there and mix it up. Even though me as a character, I'm usually thinking PC survivability, over everything. So I'm always the one looking for, where are my exits? Do I need to engage this thing? But this character, that concept was that to engage it, he couldn't just take out a bow and hide. He had to get in there and mix it up. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, well, how was I powered? I was powered by consuming the bodies of the creatures that I killed. And that was something that I had to do. So I didn't have a sensitive palate like the hypothetical younger dragon. However, if I'm in battle and I'm killing stuff, I didn't have to stop in the middle of battle to kill things. But at the end of the battle, everyone's taking their 10-minute rest, their breather, I would go eat. And I had to do it. And I tried to be slick about it. Oh, I'll try to drag something behind a bush, but it wasn't always possible. And I just had to chow down. Those were my responsibilities. And I, as a player, had to deal with and figure out how my character dealt with the ramifications of those particular things, right? Even though as a player, I may want to stay at a distance, my character can't. That's something I got to deal with. And my character can't, and my character can get magic weapons nor magic armor. Actually, he couldn't wear armor and he couldn't wear weapons. So that fun equipment of any kind of magic armor that would come up, any kind of magic weapons that come up, I couldn't take, because that was like, I had this part of my being, and therefore that stuff wasn't useful to me. And I didn't even see, and as a character, I didn't see a value in those things, because I am the weapon kind of things, right? So that was that. Now there was like a funny bit, because I could wear rings, and there actually was one of the first encounters. I don't even remember why we were there, but we were in some house, hovel, something, and we fought some stuff off, and then we were looking at the loot, and all the other PCs were fighting over this or that, not fighting, but rolling off or figuring out who's going to get this. And there was some ring that they just kind of tossed aside. And I was like, oh, what does this ring look like? And I wasn't given any clue by the GM. They said something like, oh, these are like the family was like the cart family. And this is like they called it a cart ring. It just kind of had kind of a symbol of their sort of family. They had like a little etching of a cart or something on this very simple ring. So I put the ring on. I was like, okay, well, I'll take the ring because I knew I'm not going to fight over armor and weapons. I can't use them. So I'll just take this ring. I didn't think anything of it. I just like, well, it's a ring. It's fun. It's a souvenir. I'll take it. Turned out to be a ring of protection, which annoyed the heck out of the magic user because on a meta sense, they were like, you should give me that ring because you don't need that. Because I had pretty good armor class because I was, I was given a couple of things because I couldn't wear armor and whatnot. But it ended up being one of those, not to go on a tangent about kind of metagaming, but ended up being those things where the GM was like, well, you don't know it's magic. Nobody cast detect magic on anything. You don't know it's magic. It's the only thing that I took. Everyone took all this other stuff, and I didn't even take gold in that stuff because I didn't see use for it. So for me, it was just, oh, there's this ring. I'll take it. And it turned out to be magic. Ended up bumping up my armor class 1, which I wasn't expecting, and that guy got a little bit annoyed about it, but there was nothing he could do about it because there was no reason for me to give it up. There's no reason for him to ask about it. It wasn't like I was the first one in and took it. It was literally forgotten in like a little box, and I just was the one that happened to go in there and look at it. So anyway, fun little story. But just to get back to what I was saying, I had this kind of interesting, totally one-off character concept. And through talking with the GM and going back and forth over things, we came up with, hey, here are some perks and here are some things about it. But here are these other things that you're going to have to deal with. And some of them are just things like almost more meta considerations, right? Because there is something fun to getting loot and getting weapons and getting armor and fighting. Ooh, look at this +1 this and look at this +2 that, right? No, what special abilities does that armor have? And as a player, I'm not going to get those. I can't keep them. So that's part of it where my character in the fiction doesn't care about that stuff. But me as a player, I care. It's fun. So that's something I have to deal with. But then there were these other things that I would have to deal with in the game. I would have to always go into, melee combat. And I couldn't, and would have to do that kind of eating of the dead kind of thing. And then what consequences of that? Well, I'd have to deal with it. And I'm sure that if I had been unable to deal with that, I could have then said, well, I'm going to have to sunset, let this character go because it's just, I'm finding it impossible and do something else. But, credit to the GM for letting me try because it would have been very easy to just spin it around and say, these things are too much to overcome. You can't do it. No, they say, well, if you want to play this, here's what you're going to get. Here's what you're going to give up. Here are the things you're going to have to do. And are they reasonable to you? I say yes. The GM says, hey, we can try it. And I guess that really is, if you want to wrap everything out, I know we're coming to an end of an hour, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up. And please feel free to put any questions, comments, whatever in the chat. But that kind of is really where I come out on it is, yes, there are going to be things about it, this, that, or the other, but leave it open to try it. That character, and I probably would say I played him a little bit edgelordy at first because I just didn't really know. I didn't have a clear concept of what a living weapon that had just woken up would be like. So he was kind of dour, but then I remember trying to have fun with it. And I remember, this is kind of funny. I remember the GM being like, you guys can't all be like dour, humorless, whatever. And I was like, okay, I'll make it more that he's trying to get his footing in a new world and kind of play some kind of goofiness out of it. Cause I think he might have gotten like, you guys are too, as a group, just way too edgelordy. I was like, all right, I'll try to mix it up. Unfortunately, I actually didn't get to play that long with that PC. He didn't die. It just, things happened with the game and the school year and just kind of fell apart. But is maybe one of the more memorable characters I ever played because I do remember that one as opposed to many ones I forgot. All right, from the chat, Dave Mills. Let a guy play a sentient sword that possessed anyone who touched it and was constrained by the host's physical abilities. If his host died, the party had to trick people into going back and touching it. Yeah, that is totally something. And I think I've seen that somewhere. All right, something playing that. You could totally make a game, out of that. And maybe it's up to the choice or maybe, figure out maybe when the sword's in the scabbard or something, because you need the party to maybe be able to carry it potentially when they don't have a host. Yeah, that is totally good. I mean, the only thing with something like that, and again, it's just up to your kind of game, is I don't want death to become meaningless. I don't want that player to feel like I can just run my host into just, murder, death, kill charges because I know I'm just going to find another host. So I might want there to be something. Maybe they would have to make some kind of save if their host died and then something would happen or some other penalty. So I want to figure out some way to balance that a little bit. But those are totally, I mean, I think there's a ton of awesome concepts out there. I just think it's up to us as GMs to at least be open to those concepts. And, if we can, give them a try. But I don't think it means that we have to do exactly what they want. I think you have to try to make it some version of it work. Let's see. Dave Mill says, if the host beats an ego save, they were in control. Yeah. But again, that's one of those things I want to be careful of, because then am I controlling that player? And then what's that player doing during that control? Like, how would that, this is where you just got to try to figure things out, right? Because if you say, well, the host grabs the sword, they have this contest of wills. What is the game like for that player if they lose the contest? What do the other players do with that person if they lose the contest? If Farmer Joe picks up the sword, wins the contest, and just says, okay, I'm going back to farming, thank you guys very much. I mean, one you can look at it as like, okay, well, this is up to the party to do something. Yes, I could also look at it, well, if they don't decide not to, then is that player just sunk? If the farmer then goes and puts it on their mantelpiece and they spend 60 years and whatever, like, it's just, I just want to make sure that whatever's happening isn't going to be a too high a percentage being a game killer for that character. I don't mind putting difficulty stuff in it, but I want to make sure that it's gameable in a way. And some of that stuff, I would just want to figure it out. But I think that's kind of what the process I would go through. Right? Is a player comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to be a sentient sword who does this." Then those are the things we got to work through. I'm not going to say no to it up front because I know there are going to be issues of how we balance this stuff and how we figure it out. That's like, okay, we'll see what makes sense. We'll see how that can work. Is it like a ring type situation, like the One Ring, or you have some ability to kind of get away from hosts you don't want, right? The One Ring famously didn't want to be with Isildur, so at the first moment, dropped off their finger, right? If they don't want to be with a host, are they able to kind of vibrate themselves away or do something else? Dave Mill said the player played a hireling. The only time the sword got out of pocket started a whole new quest to find the ogre mage. Did I miss something about an ogre mage? But yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. If they don't mind, again, that's another workaround, right? If you say to them, hey, you can play the sword, but in the chances that you lose this contest, you're going to have to play this NPC or play somebody else until theoretically you can get it back. That's definitely another way to work it. It really just comes down to how you and the player, or how the GM and the player, assuming you are the GM, how you as the GM and the player come together to figure out what works. And that's another thing. Like, what works for me might not work for you. What works for you might not work for me. It doesn't matter. And again, I think what I was trying to say about the internet is trying to find balanced stuff on the internet can be difficult because everyone's idea of balance is different. And the same thing, people are going to come and say in forums, on Reddit or other places, well, we did this and it was awesome. That doesn't mean it's going to be awesome for you. I think sometimes people will say stuff like, well, it works for my table, as if that means that it will work for every table. But no, everyone has different games, different conceptions. You got to figure out what's going to work for you and your table. But I think that's all I've got on this one. We're at an hour. Any last words, any last notes? And hey, as always, thanks everybody for coming and hanging out for this lunch hour stream. My cat is coughing in the background. I'm going to try to do these, I think, as often as I can. I might have trouble finding topics. So guys, feel free to comment or put in topics that you'd like to see me cover. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I'd really appreciate if you do subscribe. It helps me out a ton. And also give the thumbs up if you felt like this was a good conversation. I do have Patreon and Coffee links if you want to support the channel that way. Otherwise, hey, have a great rest of your Friday if you're watching this today. Hey, Dave Mills, good day, sir. Good day to you, sir. Game on. Fred Dano, this is fun. Thank you all. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Hope you come back for the next one. I will try to schedule them in advance so you can be able to look at. I put us in a couple places. Probably the primary place is YouTube, but it does go up on Facebook and a couple other spots. So wherever you catch it, great. But I will try to schedule them so you guys can know when to come in and let me know if the hours would work better for folks a little bit later. I don't know. I don't have a good sense if folks are mostly Eastern time like me or other places. So if I can find a time that works for me, but also works better for more folks to come in and join in and get engaged, let me know. I'm fairly flexible. Yeah, have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend if you're watching this today or on another Friday. Game on. Talk to you later.